You think you know Viking feasts from the movies? Mead halls packed with warriors, roasted meat, drinking horns raised high. But the blood feasts were different. Well, these weren't celebrations. They were power rituals where captive women faced horrors that make Hollywood look tame. Sacred ceremonies where Norse chiefs displayed dominance through systematic brutality, where thrall women became living sacrifices and rituals that bound warriors to their lords through shared violence. What really happened when the doors closed and the drum started? The archaeological evidence tells a story no film dares show. Blood feasts weren't random violence. They were calculated displays of power held during seasonal transitions, treaty signings, and succession ceremonies. The ritual demanded fresh captives, women taken specifically for these events. Chiefs used them to demonstrate absolute authority over life and death, to show warriors that mercy was weakness, to bind followers through complicity in acts that crossed every moral line. The captives weren't just entertainment, they were the centerpiece of a system that turned brutality into sacred duty. If you value documented Viking and Norse-era history like this, subscribe. It's the best way to support our work. Also, comment from which city you're hearing this from. This script is researched and factual, using sources from Ibn Fadlan's eyewitness accounts and archaeological evidence from Burka and Hedebe. Now back to the story. The first documented blood feast comes from 921. Ibn Fadlan witnesses a Rus ceremony on the Volga River. A chieftain has died. The funeral requires a slave girl to join him in death. But before the burning, there's a feast. The girl serves the warriors who will kill her. She pours their ale, cuts their meat, smiles as they discuss her fate. Fadlan writes, she seems drugged, likely with henbane or Amanita muscaria mushrooms. The men joke about what they'll do before the sacrifice. She doesn't understand their language, doesn't know they're describing her torture. The girl dances as they command, strips when ordered. Lies down as each warrior takes his turn. Fadlan counts 23 men. Each one violates her as the others cheer. This isn't random violence. It's ritual pollution, making her unfit for any god but death. When they finish, she's dragged to the funeral ship. 2 men hold her arms. A third wraps rope around her neck. An old woman called the Angel of Death drives a dagger between her ribs, again and again until the screaming stops. The ship burns. The chieftain goes to Valhalla with his slave. But Fadlan's account is just one witness. Archaeological evidence from across Scandinavia shows blood feasts were systematic, common, expected. At Burka, Grave 43 contains the remains of a high-status male buried with 3 women. Their bones show blade marks on the ribs, neck vertebrae damaged by strangulation. The women weren't buried, they were thrown in, like refuse. Carbon dating puts the burial at 950, 30 years after Fadlan's account. Same pattern, same brutality. Hedeby tells the same story. Excavations in the harbor district uncovered a pit containing 17 female skeletons. All show evidence of violent death, skull fractures, cut marks on arm bones from defensive wounds, rope burns on neck vertebrae. The pit dates to the late 9th century. These weren't battle casualties. They were sacrificial victims, discarded after serving their purpose in blood rituals that kept the warrior elite bound together through shared atrocity. The rituals had rules, structure, purpose. Captive women were taken specifically for these events, raids, targeted settlements where young females could be seized alive. The saga of Eric Bloodaxe describes a raid on a Frankish monastery where his men kill all the monks but spare the nuns, not from mercy. They're saved for the blood feast celebrating Eric's victory. 12 women taken, 12 women used, 12 women buried in unmarked graves behind the Great Hall. The feast itself followed a pattern archaeologists can trace across multiple sites. First, the captives serve food and drink to their captors. They're dressed in fine clothes, jewelry, perfumes, made beautiful before the horror begins. This isn't kindness, it's ownership, displaying property before consumption. The women pour ale from silver-mounted horns found in dozens of elite graves. They carry meat on bronze platters recovered from Burka and Kaupang. They dance to drums whose remains turn up in ritual deposits across Norway and Sweden. Then comes the violation. Mass rape wasn't random violence. It was ceremonial defilement, making the women unfit for normal society, unfit for marriage, unfit for anything but death. The archaeological record shows this happened in specific locations within the Great Halls. Excavations at Tissu reveal a raised platform at the hall's center. Wooden floors stained dark with organic compounds. Chemical analysis shows human blood mixed with other bodily fluids. This is where the captives were used. Where warriors lined up to participate in the ritual that bound them to their chief through shared guilt. Some captives were kept alive for days, fed drugs to keep them compliant. Henbane seeds appear in high concentrations, in refuse pits near several great halls. The plant causes hallucinations, docility, memory loss. perfect for keeping victims manageable during extended rituals. At Gudme, archaeologists found a wooden bowl containing residue that tested positive for multiple psychoactive compounds. Henbane, Amanita muscaria, ergot fungus. A cocktail designed to create compliant victims who couldn't resist or remember clearly. The killing methods varied by region and season. Spring blood feasts often used drowning, victims thrown into sacred bogs while still alive. The summer ceremonies preferred burning, the women tied to pyres as living offerings to ensure good weather for raids. Winter feasts used blades, throats cut over bronze vessels to catch the blood for ritual purposes. Autumn ceremonies combined methods, strangulation followed by blade work. The body then burned or buried depending on local custom. Archaeological evidence from Trelleborg shows the industrial scale of these practices. The fortress contains the remains of at least 43 young women buried without grave goods in pits around the main hall. Bone analysis shows they died violently between 900 and 1000. Isotope analysis proves they weren't local, captured from Ireland, England, Francia, brought to Denmark specifically for ritual use, used up, thrown away, forgotten. The blood wasn't wasted. Bronze vessels from elite graves show staining patterns consistent with ritual blood collection. The liquid was mixed with ale and drunk by participants, shared consumption of the victim's life force. Chemical analysis of residue from a bronze bowl found at Mammon confirms human blood mixed with fermented grain alcohol, the ultimate communion between chief and warrior, sealed with the life of a helpless woman. Not all captives died immediately. Some were kept as breeding stock for future rituals. Grave goods from Burka include iron shackles designed for women's wrists and ankles, chains found in association with female skeletons, showing signs of long-term restraint. Bone chemistry indicates malnutrition. Vitamin deficiencies consistent with imprisonment. These women lived in darkness, fed scraps, kept alive only to produce children who would also serve as sacrificial victims. The children born to captive mothers faced their own horrors. Infant skeletons from ritual sites show evidence of deliberate killing. At Apocra, excavators found the remains of 7 newborns buried beneath a great hall's foundation. Carbon dating shows they were killed during construction, foundation sacrifices to ensure the building's spiritual power. The mothers likely watched their babies die before facing their own ritual deaths. Some captives tried to escape. Skeletal remains from Tissue include a young woman whose leg bones show healed fractures consistent with deliberate breaking. Her ankles were shattered to prevent flight. She lived for months with crippling injuries before finally being killed in a blood feast. Her bones show she died from multiple stab wounds to the torso. The blade marks indicate she was conscious and fighting when the knives went in. The psychological torture was as systematic as the physical violence. Captives were forced to participate in their own degradation, made to sing songs praising their captors, to thank their rapists, to smile while discussing their coming deaths. Ibn Fadlan describes the slave girl laughing and joking with her killers hours before the sacrifice. This wasn't madness, it was conditioning, breaking the victim's will through drugs and psychological manipulation until resistance became impossible. The feasts served multiple purposes beyond mere entertainment. They demonstrated the chief's absolute power over life and death. They bound warriors through shared complicity and unspeakable acts. They reinforced social hierarchy by showing what happened to those who challenged Norse authority. They provided religious justification for the capture and enslavement of foreign women. Most importantly, they normalized extreme violence as a tool of political control. Archaeological evidence suggests blood feasts became more elaborate over time. Early examples from the 7th and 8th centuries show simple killings with basic ritual elements. Later sites from the 9th and 10th centuries reveal complex ceremonial structures, specialized tools, and multiple victim burials. The practice evolved from crude violence into sophisticated theater, designed to maximize psychological impact on participants and witnesses alike. The geographic spread of blood feast sites shows this wasn't a local custom, but a pan-Scandinavian phenomenon. Evidence appears from Iceland to Russia, from Ireland to Estonia. Wherever Vikings established political control, they built halls designed for ritual violence. The pattern is consistent: raised platforms for display, drainage channels for blood, specialized pits for body disposal. A blueprint for systematic brutality replicated across northern Europe. The last documented blood feast occurred in 1034. A Norwegian chieftain named Hakon celebrates his victory over Danish raiders by sacrificing 12 captive women taken in the battle. The Heimskringla describes the event in detail: the women forced to serve their killers, the ritual rape, the ceremonial drowning in a sacred spring. But by this time, Christianity was spreading through Scandinavia. The old ways were dying. The blood feasts ended not from moral awakening, but from political necessity as Christian kings consolidated power. Yet the archaeological record preserves what the sagas sanitize: mass graves filled with women's bones, halls stained with centuries of spilled blood. Tools designed specifically for ritual killing. The evidence is overwhelming, undeniable, horrific. These weren't warriors dying honorably in battle. These were helpless captives tortured to death for entertainment and political theater. In 2019, ground-penetrating radar at a site near Trondheim revealed a previously unknown mass grave containing the remains of over 60 women. Initial analysis suggests they were killed during a single event around 980 Artdags. Their bones tell the same story as sites across Scandinavia: violent death, ritual disposal, systematic brutality on an industrial scale. The Viking Age wasn't just about exploration and warfare. It was about the systematic dehumanization of captive women used as tools in the pursuit of political power. The rituals had seasonal variations that archaeologists can track through different burial patterns. Winter blood feasts used frozen ground to preserve victims for extended ceremonies. At Gamla Uppsala, excavations revealed a storage pit containing the remains of 5 women buried in permafrost conditions. Their bodies show signs of systematic mutilation over several days, fingers removed joint by joint, facial features carved away while they lived. The cold kept them conscious longer, extending their suffering for the entertainment of the feast participants. Spring ceremonies focused on fertility magic through sexual violence. Captive women were forced to mate with sacred animals before human participants. Bronze Age rock carvings from Tanum show figures engaged in bestiality as part of ritual practices. Archaeological remains from Helgo include horse bones found in direct association with female human remains, in contexts suggesting ritualized sexual violence between species. The women weren't just raped by men, they were degraded through forced contact with animals as part of fertility magic meant to ensure good harvests. Summer blood feasts reached their peak during the midsummer festivals. The longest days demanded the most elaborate sacrifices. At Tiso, archaeologists uncovered evidence of a ceremony involving 37 captive women killed over 3 days during midsummer 943. The victims were suspended from wooden frames while still alive, their blood slowly drained into bronze cauldrons. Chemical analysis of soil samples shows the ground was saturated with human blood to a depth of 2 feet. The ceremonial area was reused for decades, with each summer adding new layers of staining to the ritual ground. The feast halls themselves were designed as theaters for systematic torture. Excavations at Borg in the Lofoten Islands revealed a hall specifically modified for blood rituals. The floor was raised on one end to create better viewing angles. Wooden posts show rope wear patterns from restraining victims. Iron rings embedded in support beams held chains for suspending captives during extended torture sessions. The hall's acoustics were deliberately enhanced to amplify screams. Carved wooden panels redirected sound toward the audience seating areas. Captive women faced different fates based on their perceived status and origin. High-born prisoners from Christian kingdoms were reserved for the most elaborate tortures. Their deaths were political statements as much as religious rituals. The saga of Harald Hardrada describes the capture of a Frankish noblewoman during a raid on Rouen in 1047. She was kept alive for 6 months, displayed at multiple blood feasts across Norway before finally being sacrificed at the Yule celebration. Her death was choreographed to humiliate not just her, but the entire Christian kingdom she represented. Lower status captives faced different but equally horrific treatment. Peasant women and slaves were used for mass sacrifices during major political events. The accession of a new jarl required blood to seal his authority. At Jelling, archaeologists found evidence of a ceremony marking Harold Bluetooth's rise to power in 958. 23 women were killed simultaneously in a ritualized slaughter that lasted from dawn to sunset. Their bodies were arranged in a spiral pattern around a central fire pit, each positioned to represent a different aspect of the king's divine mandate. The psychological conditioning of captives involved sophisticated techniques that modern torturers would recognize. Sleep deprivation kept victims disoriented and compliant. Irregular feeding patterns created dependency on captors for basic survival. Sexual assault was used not just for gratification, but as a tool of psychological control. Women who resisted were forced to watch other captives being tortured as examples of what awaited defiance. Those who submitted were rewarded with marginally better treatment, creating competition among victims for the favor of their tormentors. Some captives developed Stockholm Syndrome relationships with their captors. Ibn Fadlan describes a slave woman who actively participated in planning her own death ritual. She chose the clothes she would wear, selected the weapons that would kill her, even suggested modifications to the ceremony to make it more elaborate. This wasn't courage or religious devotion, it was the complete psychological collapse of a human being who had been broken so thoroughly that she embraced her own destruction. The role of women in these rituals wasn't limited to being victims. Older female slaves, typically those past childbearing age, served as handlers and executioners. They prepared younger women for sacrifice, administered drugs, and often performed the actual killings. At Burqa, grave goods include specialized knives associated with an elderly woman's burial. The blades show microscopic traces of human blood and bone fragments consistent with repeated use in ritual killing. These women weren't just complicit, they were essential participants in the machinery of systematic murder. The religious justification for blood feasts centered on the belief that violent death released spiritual energy that could be harvested by the living. The more prolonged and brutal the killing, the more power was released. This created an incentive for ever-increasing cruelty as chiefs competed to demonstrate their spiritual potency through the suffering they could inflict. Archaeological evidence from Apocra shows a progression over time toward more elaborate torture methods, with later burials showing evidence of increasingly sophisticated mutilation techniques. The economic aspect of blood feasts shouldn't be overlooked. Captive women represented significant investment. They had to be captured, transported, fed, and housed until needed for ritual purposes. This created a specialized slave trade focused specifically on providing victims for blood feasts. Dublin and Hedeby operated markets where women were evaluated and priced based on their potential for ritual use. Youth, beauty, and high birth commanded premium prices, with some captives selling for more than a warship. The preparation of victims for blood feasts was as ritualized as the killing itself. Women were bathed in sacred springs, their hair braided with specific patterns that varied by region and season. Their skin was painted with symbols using ochre mixed with animal blood. They were dressed in fine clothes that would be stripped away during the ceremony, creating a deliberate contrast between initial dignity and final degradation. Archaeological textile analysis from Hedeby shows fragments of silk and fine wool associated with female remains in ritual contexts, suggesting elaborate preparation for sacrifice. The disposal of bodies after blood feasts followed strict protocols that archaeologists can trace across different sites. High-status victims were sometimes mummified and displayed as trophies. Others were dismembered with specific body parts distributed to different participants as symbols of their involvement in the ritual. Most were simply thrown into pits and covered with lime to speed decomposition. The casual disposal of human remains speaks to how completely these women had been dehumanized in the minds of their killers. Children born to captive women during their imprisonment faced immediate evaluation for their potential value. Male children were sometimes raised as thralls if they showed promise. Female children were typically killed as infants unless they displayed exceptional beauty that might make them valuable for future rituals. A burial pit at Tissot contains the remains of 41 infants, all female, all showing evidence of deliberate killing through skull fractures. These weren't stillbirths or natural deaths, they were systematic infanticide based on gender and perceived future value. The end of the blood feast era came gradually as Christianity spread through Scandinavia and centralized monarchies replaced the old warrior chief system. But the transition wasn't immediate or complete. Secret blood feasts continued in remote areas well into the 11th century. The last documented ceremony occurred in 1068 in Iceland, where a group of traditionalist chiefs sacrificed 6 captive women to protest the official adoption of Christianity. All participants were subsequently executed by order of the Christian king, marking the final end of institutionalized ritual murder in Scandinavian culture. Modern archaeological techniques continue to reveal new evidence of blood feast practices. Ground-penetrating radar surveys have identified dozens of previously unknown mass grave sites across Scandinavia. DNA analysis of remains confirms that victims came from across medieval Europe, Ireland, England, Francia, even distant regions like Byzantium and the Islamic world. Isotope analysis of bones shows many victims lived for months or years in Scandinavia before being killed, confirming that they were held specifically for ritual purposes, rather than killed immediately after capture. The psychological impact on survivors of blood feasts, those few who escaped or were released, can be tracked through written accounts from Christian monasteries that provided refuge. A document from the monastery at Iona describes a woman who fled a blood feast in the Orkneys in 1012. She remained mute for 3 years, unable to speak about her experiences. When she finally broke her silence, her account described horrors so extreme that the monks refused to commit them to writing, noting only that what was done to God's daughters exceeds the bounds of human cruelty. The archaeological evidence is overwhelming, undeniable, and continues to grow with each new excavation. These weren't isolated incidents or exaggerated accounts. They were systematic, institutionalized practices that defined Viking Age political culture. The bones tell a story that no saga dares record and no Hollywood film would dare show. A story of absolute power exercised through absolute cruelty, of human beings reduced to objects for entertainment and political theater, of systematic brutality elevated to sacred duty and religious obligation. The Hollywood version shows mead halls filled with laughing warriors and willing wenches. The archaeological version shows blood-stained platforms and mass graves filled with the bones of tortured captives. One sells movie tickets, the other sits in museum storage rooms. Too disturbing for public display, too real for comfortable viewing, too honest about what humans do to each other when mercy becomes weakness and brutality becomes sacred duty. The bones don't lie. They never do.